go for it.
Okay, Larry. Um, uh, what did it feel like? What was the first thing that crossed your mind when the real coronavirus was identified in China and you had this book just ready to pop? Did you think it would help, hurt, get you arrested? What was on your mind?
Oh, well, the first thing that crossed my mind after the Chinese made that announcement, I think it was New Year's Eve, I thought about SARS. And, it was China had hid the ball during the SARS outbreak in 2003. And it was a miracle that it got stopped within 150 days. And I worried that it was going to be something like that. And it did cross my mind that this might coincide with the publication of my book. We'd already changed they wanted to bring it out in the fall, but we decided not to because of the election. So we pushed it to the spring. And looking down the road, I could see that there might be a coincidence. And I didn't know how that was going, would it be tonally wrong? Would people think I was profiteering off of it? Or, I didn't know how people might react to it.
It seems to me tonally just right, in that the heroes are the scientists, really, in this book, I guess. And I mean, I know you know a lot about a lot of different subjects, but how did you ever learn this much about the science? And how did this idea come to you in the first place?
Well, it started a decade ago when Ridley Scott, the filmmaker, who had read this Cormac McCarthy novel, The Road. It's about a post-apocalyptic story about a father and son wandering through the ruins of civilization. And Ridley just asked me what happened, because Cormac doesn't bother to explain. And I got the idea that it would be a pandemic. Because as a young reporter, I'd done some stories that took me into the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and I was very enchanted with that world. And Ridley didn't make the movie, and I don't blame him, because I hadn't solved the story, and I hadn't done the research that I needed to do to let the plot unfold naturally. So I put it away, but I never forgot that it was a story that I had in my head. And then a couple of years ago, I decided I would write it as a novel. But this time I would go all the way in, just as I would do, or you would do, if we were doing a New Yorker story or a nonfiction book.
And so you actually have a screenplay version of this.
Yeah.
You actually did you went through the work of actually writing a whole screenplay of it.
I did, but that was 10 years ago. And Ridley went off and made Robin Hood instead. So
it has it's a thriller. Have you written a thriller before?
No, the only other novel that I wrote was about Manuel Noriega, and it was called God's Favorite. And I had a really good time. I enjoyed doing that. But this was, something that had, it was a story that had wormed its way into my brain, and I just couldn't quite get rid of it. So I decided I would have to give it a shot at life. And, I don't have a reputation much as a novelist. I understand that, but I wanted to do it, and wanted to see if I could do it as well.
I mean, for someone who's sort of trained in being absolutely accurate, checking every quote, every single weather report for the day where you're describing a scene, I would think in some ways it would feel like having all your bones broken to have to write fiction. I mean, it's everything you're trained not to do. Is it hard to just sit there and make it up, or is it incredibly liberating not to have to deal with the fact checkers anymore?
Well, Jane, I still work from reality. So in that sense, it's not that different for me. The key to being able for me to write it is to understand the science and do the research and enlist these co-conspirators, these great scientific minds that I was able to talk with into helping me through this. And that I could not have written it as a nonfiction or a fiction without that kind of assistance.
Well, I was thinking about, it's not just a coincidence that you were able to anticipate a story that's so much in the zeitgeist now. Maybe it's a coincidence that it's this one, but you kind of over and over again have been able to write about subjects that where you anticipate where the clash is coming and where the culture is going and where society's going. And I'm thinking about the work that you've done on terrorism too. And in many ways, you were way ahead of the curve on seeing the threat from Al Qaeda and terrorism. So I guess I wonder, as a fellow writer, how do you figure that out? I mean, how do you look for your topics? Do you just sort of have a funny bone sense about where things are going? Do you sort of ask yourself, what are the big questions this country is going to be facing? How do you wind up with beating the daily news? You're scooping the daily newspapers with a novel.
Well, Jane, I think part of my method is to start with a question. And as a reporter, the question usually is what happened. But as a novelist of this sort, it's more what could happen. And for instance, when I wrote this movie, The Siege, which came out in 1998, with Denzel Washington and Annette Bening, the question I had in my mind was, what would happen if terrorism came to America? What if it happened in New York City? And, that was the first time I got this tag of being prophetic, but it was just a matter of asking the question and finding the experts, the counter-terrorists in that case, who were very preoccupied by this same question. They knew something like that would happen. The same thing was true when I talked to these epidemiologists and medical experts. They spent their entire careers thinking about what was going to happen. They knew a pandemic of this sort would hit us, but they didn't know exactly when. But what they told me, their anxieties and what would happen, that's all what the novel is.
Well, I suppose you can't help but then wonder, why is it that the people we've elected to take care of us and to run the United States government did not ask the same question: what would happen if there were a pandemic, and why we aren't better prepared for it? If a novelist or a journalist can be asking that question, what do you think of the performance of our own government in this situation? And why do you think it did not, if the scientists were there who had the answers, where was the disconnect here?
Well, I cannot convey how dismayed I am by the way that this administration has handled this. It's not as if there weren't people who told people in the administration about this. There was a briefing book handed off that gave us a scenario for exactly what you should do in the case of a pandemic. There were tabletop exercises every year at places like Johns Hopkins, laying out very similar scenarios. There were wonderful experts who actually worked for the government, who were the same people that I talked to now developing the vaccines. It was not a mystery. It was not hidden knowledge. It was well known. It was, there were departments inside the government. Unfortunately, some of them, like the Global Health Response Team that was a part of the National Security Council, was axed in one of the very first actions that the Trump administration took. This cuts for the Center of Disease Control. I'll tell you, Jane, I don't know if it's lack of leadership or the budget cuts are being folded into the Health and Human Services, but that was once a great institution. And it's heartbreaking to see how humbled it has been by this challenge, and how many American lives have been lost because we weren't able to get the testing up, and still haven't been able to get the testing up nearly half a year after we first been aware of it.
I mean, excuse me, and among the other organizations, the CDC certainly plays a heroic part in your book, and people have been wondering why it's played such a recessive role. in our own situation here. The World Health Organization also plays a role in your book, doesn't it? And you see the extent to which the scientists from around the world need to be able to discuss and collaborate on solving these problems. How did you feel about the situation that the World Health Organization was put in? Is that something you've worried about as well?
Oh, I am, yeah. And I think that, what we have to understand about the World Health Organization is it has no power. It's a supplicant. It is there to coordinate, international responses, but it cannot, for instance, go into China without China's permission. China wouldn't let the WHO in for more than 3 weeks after the discovery of this coronavirus. And so, essentially the WHO has to beg in order to get in. If we were to award that organization some authority, I think that we'd have a better response. But what's striking to me is how there's no international organization that's overseeing this. Every nation is doing it differently. Every state within America, everybody's improvising, down to the counties and the cities and the towns. There's an absence of leadership that is so stark all across the board. That's very dismaying.
One of the things that it seems there's a comment you have someone making in the book. It's, I think, the lead doctor he shows up in Saudi Arabia, and the royal family, the leader of the royal family, I guess it's the king there, gets to make a decision that moves the whole government. And there's kind of an aside where you sort of say, well, there are, basically some advantages with having an autocracy. Those kind of governments can move fast. Do you feel that this is a real strain on democracies to have a pandemic like this? And do you worry a little bit that there may be some anti-democratic results coming out of it?
I do. I think, for one thing, just the process of democracy, the campaigning, the conventions, the voting, all of those things are in peril. And, I think it's very difficult to conceive how can people safely exercise their franchise. It worries me a lot. And I've also considered, this is one of those moments in history where we see the shortcomings of our society. And, you look back at the Great Depression, America remade its society during that period of time, made it stronger, more cohesive, more compassionate, a far better country. And then there was World War II, another enormous challenge in which America stepped up and became the greatest power on earth, in the history of the earth. And then in our own time, I think, like 9/11 was a lost moment. When I remember so well the sense that, we're going to have to stand for something now. And, we're going to have to rise up and be the kind of America that our parents gave to us. And instead we invaded Iraq, one of the most colossal mistakes we could have made. I think in this period, we have a great opportunity to, make changes in our society that I think we all agree must be made, but it's not at all guaranteed. It's going to be a challenge. But if we fail in this, I think it's going to be a step back for America that will be a very long time in remedying.
I mean, one of the things you also anticipate in the book that I thought was, some of the details that you got right, not just on the medical things, but on the politics are wild. And including that, you're talking about, well, of course, the rich will get the vaccine faster than the poor will, and the rich and powerful, and how we've seen this sort of pandemics lay bare the inequality in the country. But how did you even know or imagine that, for instance, the president would put the vice president in charge of dealing with the pandemic, and that the president would sort of step back and instead blame his predecessors for, not leaving him a better game plan, and blaming everybody would really be the response, blaming all enemies. How did you, is that based on previous experiences, or are you just looking at how politics works and just thinking that's got to have to be how it happens?
Yeah, I think more of the latter, Jane. I just throughout and with the geopolitics in this, I just looked at the world as it is, and all the fractures and this is the antagonisms, and then I added a stress, which was the pandemic, and imagine plausible directions in which this could go. And as for the vice president getting the job, it just seemed like the kind of handoff that a president would give to a vice president that was essentially thought to be meaningless but might be a problem, and he didn't want to have his fingerprints on it.
Well, you were sure on the money. I mean, so how much do you feel you did get right? And that's the first part of the question. The second is, I don't want to spoil the book, but it takes us beyond in time where we are now. We are basically in the first phase of your book, and then your book takes us into the future of what happens next with this story. What I want to know is, do you feel that you got it right in the first place up till now, where we've actually seen reality? And do you think that you have accurately predicted where we're going in the later part of the book?
Jane, I hope not. I'm sick of the coincidences. I think they can stop now. I do worry about the drift of international relations, with all this blame that's being tossed around. And that concerns me. These are unsubstantiated charges and dangerous by their nature. I think that, in the book, I created a calendar on my computer for the 1918 flu. And then I sort of mapped out my fictional flu to follow the 1918 flu. And what's interesting to me is how both of those track the experience that we're having right now. The COVID-19 so far has moved along very much like the 1918 flu. What worries me, of course, is that, the second wave, the October 1918 was the most fatal month in American history. And, somewhere along the line in the summer, the influenza, which was already a killer disease in the spring, mutated and became far more virulent. And I don't predict anything, but that's the scenario that I envisioned.
And this is the worry that the scientists you interviewed had?
Yeah,
the bounce?
Well, the idea of the second wave, I mean, waves are something I think a lot of people are getting used to hearing about and dreading maybe. But, this is the nature of a novel pandemic, a disease that has the opportunity to find people who have no immunity and feast on them. And it will, this particular virus is so far more stable than the flu. Every year the flu mutates, and that's why every year they make a vaccine, and it's a stab in the dark to some extent, trying to figure out what the flu is going to be like. But other than that, they're very similar viruses in that they're RNA viruses, and their characteristic is they can change. And it could be that coronavirus will change and become less dangerous or less contagious. That might happen, and that's what usually happens. So I've got my finger crossed.
I'm curious about you personally, having done all this research. When you did hear that there was a novel coronavirus, did you become like one of those survivalists who stocks up, with a very deep larder full of things that won't spoil for 2 years? Or, how did it affect you in your own life?
Well,
knowing this much.
New York in January, the latter part of January, and I was concerned. Then we moved. We were rehearsing a play that we took to Houston in the 1st of February, and by that time I had already ordered masks and gloves,
You did.
Yeah,
You
and when I got
N95s? Did
yes,
you know to get? You
yeah,
did know.
that much I knew, so I had, and when I got back to Austin on February 21st, that's when we started, stocking up on groceries and stuff like that. I didn't think to sell my stock, so I have some profit, but we did have food and I planted some seeds. I just figured that, we're going to be in for it.
Ease up this summer, as they did in 1918. People had a sort of false sense of comfort.
Yeah, I think I live in Texas, and I think we're experiencing that false sense of comfort right now. Texas has been more lightly treated than many other states, and so we've had a better experience. But the governor is opening up much of the state, and even the barbershops and nail salons. And I worry a little bit. I worry a lot that we may be jumping the gun and having a sense of complacency that we shouldn't.
As a Texan, are you surprised that this has become a culture war battlefront?
No, that just says a lot about my opinion about where people are right now in our country. The idea that wearing a mask is a political statement rather than one of public health and concern for your own health and those of your neighbors, that to me is I think this will be something we'll remember, that the country was so divided that we couldn't even agree on that.
So, Larry, can I also, I have to ask as sort of, it's not personal, but I'm so amazed at how you move from one genre to another and take on all of these challenges. Do you, I mean, including performing on stage, do you ever get scared about taking on these crossing these new thresholds, performing on stage, performing an instrument that you only learned in your grown-up life on stage, writing plays, taking a flyer with novels, movies? I mean, does it seem daunting to you, or does it just seem fun?
Well, Jane, I sometimes I think there are certain moments in my life where some crystal truth has come to me, either something that sprung into my mind or something someone told me. And years ago, when I was reporting in San Francisco, I was interviewing a witch. She's a rather famous witch named Starhawk, and I confessed that I was coming back to Austin. I was going to make my first public speech. And when I speak in public, sometimes my voice gets high. I couldn't ask questions at press conferences, which is a real handicap. And anyway, Starhawk told me, well, we witches have a saying, where there's fear, there's power.
Ooh.
Yeah, I had that same reaction. It sounds nice, sounds interesting. What does it mean? And when I was on the plane flying home, I was still chewing over. And I decided that what she meant by that is that it wasn't that I was afraid that I was going to pee in my pants. I was afraid of being the kind of person who could go out and be vulnerable, whose voice would rise and shake, and maybe his knees would tremble, but still be vulnerable and open like that. And that's exactly what happened when I made my speech. My voice did get high and all the things that I had dreaded. But after that, I was never afraid of speaking in public. And even when I was doing those one-man shows, I couldn't wait to get on stage. And that was it was a total transformation. So now when I see these opportunities arise and they frighten me a little bit, I know maybe I should look at it more seriously.
And just try it. I mean, just wing it and see.
If it turns out to be an aspect of myself that needs to be fulfilled, then I should give myself to it. And the other adage that I live by, I made a resolution decades ago that I would only do things that were really important or really fun. So
I love that.
because you get many opportunities in life, and how do you make the choices? And I thought, if I want to be a part of the important conversation, but I don't want to give up the joy, the pleasure that especially our career offers us. And so, as long as I navigate between those two poles, I feel like I'll be on the right track.
Well, this book is both important and fun, which is kind of a triumph. I guess I should also ask, what are you going to do? Do you have a next genre you haven't tried yet? Is ballet in the future? Or,
Well, finally, yeah.
What's that?
I am writing a musical.
Of course. Really? Are you really?
Yeah, very much so. I'm working with my son and with Marcia Ball, who's a great,
I love Marcia Ball,
beloved figure in Austin, great musician. And it's about Texas politics, which makes you want to break into song. But I'm having a tremendous amount of fun doing it. And so, it was one of those things that was in my mind. And you get to a point in your life where you think now or never. And so I decided it was time for me to write a musical.
And will this, do you think, now see the silver screen or some version of that? Do you have any idea? Because since it was originally written with that in mind long 10 years ago.
Well, Ridley has reattached himself as director, so we'll see.
Oh, is that right?
That's
news.
It's Hollywood, and so I've learned not to count any chickens, and and also I'm glad he didn't make it the first time, because I hadn't figured it out. And also, writing a screenplay for a director, it's a friend of mine says it's like raising children for adoption. So
that's great.
It wasn't entirely mine, but writing a novel gave me a chance to own it.
Well, congratulations. It's really fantastic. And I see Brad has reappeared.
Jane and Larry, there are a few questions. Can you see them on the right of your screen?
I can see them. Can you see them, Jane?
Oh, yes, I can. Larry, you don't need me to read them out. I guess I should read them so the other listeners can see.
Yeah, you pick them out.
Can the other listeners see the questions or not?
I'm not sure. Why don't you just, some of them cover ground that you've already talked about. But,
yeah.
But let's just go. We've got a little more time. You could go through them.
Okay.
Well, it says, what interested you to write this book? We may have covered that somewhat. Were you very interested in the main character? He seems a complicated and compelling character.
Yeah.
Was he a real person or something you invented?
There are many ingredients that went into the creation of Henry Parsons. There was the name, actually, Henry Parsons, I borrowed from a 19th century country doctor who had that name, and he became a deputy health minister during this pandemic of influenza in Britain in the end of the 19th century. And at that time, flu was still thought to be caused by miasmas, by environmental gases. And Henry Parsons was the very first to demonstrate that it was actually spread by contagion. It was a momentous moment in epidemiology, but he's been rather forgotten. So I decided I would bring him back to life by giving my character his name and maybe some of his qualities.
And there's a sub theme running through it about religion a little bit. Is this something you've been grappling with yourself, and whether to be, have faith or not have faith? Well,
I was a very pious teenager, and I've left that world, but I've never stopped being interested in religious faith and why people believe one thing rather than another. So I've written about Mormons and Scientologists and Baptists and Catholics and radical Islamists. I've had my whole life has been dotted with stories. My first book was about the Amish, so I've always been intrigued by what drives people. And I, as a reporter, I appreciate the fact that faith is a far more powerful force in a person's life than politics.
Okay, so here's a question Harold asks. Is there anything that you could suggest to parents that they do to prepare their families to survive the worst that you think could happen? Since this is a story really about a family also.
Well, the worst that could happen, there's a lot of grief in the world right now because of this disease, and there will be more. And I think in some ways, this period for children has been almost a golden age. They've got their parents to themselves. The streets are made for bicycles. I think a lot of kids will look back at this as a great time, but being close during this period of time is extremely important because you don't know what's going to happen next. And knitting the family unit together, I think, is really important. And for people that aren't in families, maintaining contact with friends, even by Zoom or something like that, absolutely vital, because it starves us spiritually and emotionally to be without friends, without family. And we can't lose the habit of loving each other, and that's something that we're going to really need if it grows darker in the future.
And here's one last question, which actually takes you back to the Looming Tower. It's from someone named Gopal, and he asks, Looming Tower showed a fractured US government, the CIA not sharing or talking to the FBI. Now we see yet another collapse of government power, leadership. Do you see parallels?
Yeah, I do. It's, unfortunately, our government is not a new thing. That, incompetence and the lack of accountability have characterized some of the most important moments in our recent history. And yes, there are strong parallels. And, I think, just as after 9/11, we had to address not only the threat of terror, but our own failure as a country to be unified, with our intelligence agencies. So we're going to have to amend all the problems that we have in our medical establishment right now.
That makes a lot of sense. Brad, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Larry, I want to thank you for letting me have this fun of talking to you about it. Thank you so much. Wonderful book.
Any occasion is a joyful one for me.
Thanks to both of you for remaining cool under very trying technical circumstances. Nonetheless, you carried on a fascinating conversation, and I think we had quite a few viewers. To those of you who also stayed with us, our appreciation. Remember, you can buy Larry's book, The End of October, by going to the PNP website and ordering a copy or several copies. And thanks again to everybody for tuning in. From all of us at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.